Happy Life by Givaldo Pereira Franco and Joana de Angelis. Everyone suffers while in the world. Pain is an efficient method for renewal when love and its benefits are lacking. In the face of this, the spirit must confront many varied hues. It is necessary to receive pain with dignity and confidence. What is a torment today, a threat tomorrow, will become peace. Physical or mental illness, or economic or moral affliction, passes. Their results depend on the way they are received. Do not consider yourself unhappy, therefore, when you are suffering. Take the benefits of suffering and go on encouraged.
So let's now elevate our thoughts to our Master Jesus and all the beloved friends that are present here today with us. Let's ask them to open our minds and our hearts to observe as much as possible for the lecture today, that they may inspire us to understand a little bit more of what Jesus brought. Thank you, so be it.
Good morning. Good morning. Hold on. Bear with me. It's just like crossing. Simple. Yeah, okay. It's great to see you all here this morning. As Otto said, it's raining. It's not easy to leave bed on a Sunday. So thank you guys online too. Today we're going to talk about Paul of Tarsus. And this is such an important character for the New Testament, for Christianism, because he is one of the main reasons why we know so much about Christ and about what happened during those years. So when we think about Paul of Tarsus and who was this man, we may not connect, because sometimes we have so many characters in the Bible, and sometimes you get confused because they seem to have the same names, but no, this is not the person we are talking about. This is someone else. So for us to have an idea exactly what we are talking about whom we are talking about, Paul is known as Saint Paul, for those who came from Catholic background, as we have the city of São Paulo in Brazil. So that's the same Paul. He is also known as the Apostle or the Great Convert, and we are going to see why the Great Convert. But the thing is, he is very important because he wrote 13 letters describing the life of Jesus and what Jesus came here to do. So the great part of what we know of the New Testament, or what we know about Christ, is because of Paul. And so he wrote 13 letters. Those are, the greatest part of the New Testament. And if it doesn't ring any bell, it probably will if I make this work. Hold on. It will now if we read these words. So, if I speak in the tongues of men or angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. And so goes on. So I'm quite sure that at least at some point in life, we heard those words. And then this is one of the most important contributions, at least, because even if you don't know much, those words are not totally strange to us. And they talk so much about love, right? Those words express, and they are very deep. And then you think of, so Paul of Tarsus was such a loving man. Yes, he was. But that was not always like this. Because Paul was born Saul. And Saul was a Pharisee. And for those of you who don't know what a Pharisee is a sect from the Judaism. And they are very strict in following the laws of Moses. The laws of an eye for an eye, basically, a tooth for a tooth. And he was a doctor of the law. So his job in the world was actually to make sure that the law of Moses was being fulfilled, was being complied with. And he is described as a brave man, indomitable man, as someone who is passionate. And he was very good in the art of speaking. He was a very good speech maker. He was very good at convincing people. So bear in mind those characteristics: being brave, being passionate, and being responsible for taking care of the law of Moses, making sure that people were actually complying with it. It's going to be important really soon. But then you might be asking yourself, so how could he come from a brave man, making sure that the law of Moses, which is not as loving as the law of Christ, a law of love, how can he become, he can go from this person to an apostle of Christ? So he came from a persecutor. He was known as the first persecutor in Christianism, to an apostle. How did that happen? So with the characteristics I just explained, being brave, keeping the laws, that's a result of him being proud. I mean, all that brought him a sense of pride, because he was famous in their community, in his community. He was famous because of the art of speaking, because he was very young when he first started doing his speeches and convincing people and whatsoever. If you bear in mind that we are talking here about 1 to 2 years after Christ's crucifixion, and if you remember, if you know a little bit, his disciples, Christ's disciples, continued to work. They worked against those who were in favor of those who were in need, the orphans, the lepers, the poor of any kind. Those men, the disciples of Christ, were known as the men of the way. And they continued to work towards Christ's loving ideals and messages. They keep passing on the message. But they were considered by the Pharisees as people who were ignorant, who were poor, so they shouldn't be considered so much. But what does that have to do with Saul? So Saul was originally in Damascus. He wasn't living there at the time. But then he heard about the men of the way. He heard that they were spreading words against the law of Moses, right? So he decided to go see with his own eyes what that was about. So he goes to Jerusalem, and when he gets there, he gets to know about someone who became very famous for his speeches, for his care with those who were suffering, who were in pain. And that man is Stephen. So if you think about the names, Paul of Tarsus, who was born Saul, and then Stephen, you might be thinking about a very famous book, Paul and Stephen. And that's exactly where we take great part of this lecture from. And then if you haven't read this, I really recommend. Get your tissues and then read it, because this is a very beautiful and touching book. But who is Stephen? So the book tells a story. There are several stories in the book, and the book goes through the details of it, and we can't go. But Stephen, just to try to make a summary of this, wasn't born Stephen either, right? But because of all the hurdles he had in life and all the hardships and difficulties he changed his name, and now he becomes Stephen. And he used to be a Jew too. But after all the suffering he had to go through, he learned, he got in touch with the words of Jesus. So he learned, and then he converted too. And then he was spreading the words. He joined the men of the way, and they started spreading the words of Jesus. And he became very, very famous because of that, because he was very good at that. He was very good at sharing all this love he had received. So Saul, getting to know about all that, about the men of the way, about Stephen, he decides to get to know those guys. What they are doing there? Why are they so famous? What kind of work they are doing? So he goes and he visits their little church on the way. And listening to what Stephen was saying, he gets very impressed. But how powerful that man is, even though he's very calm. And and very convincing in a sense, and he gets touched by that. So remember that I said that Saul comes from a place of pride. So even though he was very impressed with Stephen, he was also feeling like understanding and trying to get this feeling of pride, touching himself. So he tries to tries to prove Stephen wrong. So he keeps asking questions. But Stephen was so good at what he was saying, and he also knew a lot about the old scriptures. So they had this kind of engagement, and Saul was getting more and more irritated, angrier with the situation. And then there is a point that Saul starts to have a vendetta against Stephen. So he goes after him. He tries to prove him wrong, and he was going against the laws of Moses. So Saul was in charge of keeping the law complied, let's say. So long story short, he manages to have Stephen to be judged. Stephen is sentenced to be stoned to death. And so it happens. And in the end, when he was about to discarnate, he was very weak, very hurt. Saul was expecting Stephen to be angry at him. He was expecting Stephen to be cursing him and not feeling all the love he had. But Stephen, he wasn't full of hatred. He was full of love. He continued to believe and defend and take a stand with Jesus. And he had this very powerful, even though he was hurt to death, he was about to discarnate. He didn't have any hatred. He looked in the eyes of Saul and he forgave him. Such experience was so strong for Saul that he couldn't understand. How does this man, what kind of power is that? How can he be still so calm, so placid, and have this such power inside of him when he's about to die and after everything I've done to him? But that was not enough to change, to convert Saul, let's say, because he could understand, he could feel that power, but he wasn't very much convinced. But so he kept this feeling at the back of his head. How is that supposed to be? How is that possible? But again, he was brave. He believed that the law of Moses was the only law that existed. He didn't believe in this carpenter from Nazareth. No, this is not right. So he continues to persecute all the Christians and that were at the time, the ones that were working in the sowing the seeds of love Jesus asked them to do. And he continues, and he goes an extra miles I would say, because he would go not only in the city of Jerusalem, he would go to other cities trying to make the words, try to keep them quiet, trying not to have Christianism to spread. And in one of those moments, he heard about Ananias, and he continued to spread the word of Christ around, and then he decides to travel, just like he did when he went to Jerusalem to try to know what the men of the way were doing. He goes to Damascus so that he can, finish what was happening with Ananias. But then something very special and very different happens to him at that moment. However, those are not my words. I'll pass the word to Michelle. Michelle is going to continue the story to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Erika. Good morning, everyone. Good to see all faces here this morning. So, Erika gave me a introduction, and like she said, Saul was this strong man, and when he asked and give the order to execute Stephen, he never imagined Stephen was his fiance's brother, right? Her name is Abigail. If you want to know more about her, just read the book. It's fascinating. Like Erika said, prepare your tissue papers, and it's a very emotional book. So, but he could, because his pride, he was so angry about this Stephen, he couldn't accept he had a fiancé who had a brother like him, right? For him, you'd be so shamed, right? And what he did, he broke up with her. Said, I don't want it, right? He loved her so much, but his pride was above his love, right? So after a few months, Saul discovered Abigail was sick, and he went to visit her, right? He was desperate. He went to visit her. He had a hope she's gonna come back with him and forgive everything, right? But what happened? He knew Abigail was turned one of the Jesus followers through Ananias, who she already told was, right? He gets so angry, and the mix of feelings on that moment, see his loved one almost, right, dying, and on the same time she converted too, right? And he said, what's going on here, right? I can't accept that. And she passed, I'm a little shaking. So he came to visit her and see his face. He was so angry. Inside him, he didn't know what to do in that moment. So she passed away, and you see how to put like this one? I can't. Yeah. Do you see this man here with was Stephen? He came on that moment, and Abigail told him, it's my brother's here, it's time for me to go. He couldn't understand, and he wants to know who was Ananias, and he said, no, I need to find out this man, and I need to kill him, right? He was further sharpened with his fury and revolt. He all mixed it together, right? For him, Abigail died because of that, and he wants to go and kill this man. That's why he started his journey to Damascus, because he find out Ananias lived in Damascus. In his journey, something very special happened. Through this journey, he was all thinking about what happened, right? Why Stephen was so calm down, forgive him, right? And Abigail, when she passed away, she told him, right, to forgive and everything. And she told him Steve was there. So all this mixed was in his mind. And when he was approaching to Damascus, a beautiful light came toward him. And when you read the book, you can feel that emotion. You can't, we cannot explain. Just read the book. You need to read. And he got blind. He couldn't see who was in front of him, but he felt the presence of someone with a different, inexplicable energy close to him. So he just asked, right, who are you? And in a soft and firm voice, answered him, I'm Jesus. Why are you pursuing me? And Saul was taken by uncontrollable emotion. He started to cry like a kid when they get hurt. He started to cry, and his soldiers was close to him, couldn't understand, because they didn't see the light, they didn't see was saying, oh, Saul starts to be crazy, because he starts to cry, he starts to talk to someone, and he couldn't stop crying. And in that moment, when Jesus talked to him, I'm Jesus, why you pursued me? And he could understand the magnitude of the man in front of him. He was touched by these feelings. And he could understand this man was Stephen and Abigail were following. He finally could understand. Because can you imagine now we see Jesus in front of us. His power, his love is touch whatever we have inside us, right? And Jesus knew in that moment that he was ready to change. He was ready to move on, right? Since he killed, let's see that Stephen, something inside him already starts to change, right? And he just asked, he didn't ask, when he saw, he heard Jesus, he didn't ask for forgiveness, he didn't ask, right, forgive him what he did, or excuses for what he did, because sometimes we just try to find excuses for our own mistakes instead to, instead to move on, right? We try to find excuses. So he didn't ask for forgiveness, he didn't ask for or justify what he did. No, he just simple ask, what would you like me to do, master? And when he said that, master, we already see his change. A pride man who think he was the doctors of the law, and he was pursuing Jesus, right? He didn't accept, and instead he already called him master. We can see already he's changing, right? And Jesus answered him, go to Damascus, and there you'll be guided, and your eyes will be open again, physically and spiritually. And he went. The soldiers abandoned him, and he went through Damascus. And guess who helped him? Who was the man who was waiting for him already to help him? Any guess? Ananias. Ananias. He was already received the message. Saul was coming, and he received him in her house, cure him. He could see again. And that moment, Paul just said, he gave to everything inside him to help and to follow, right? And Saul, after this meeting between him and Ananias, he changed his name to Paul of Tarsus, to leave all the past behind, right? Because this was very important, to leave all this, because he was shamed. He was, right? When he realized what he did, he just was, no, I don't want this anymore. And he needs to change for some reason too, right? We can't go through this here, otherwise we're going to be here until 1 p.m. So he changed his name for Paul of Tarsus, what we know today, and leave all this past behind and start a new journey. He became one of the most important disciples of Jesus, preaching, establishing churches, and accept with resignation all the suffering he had. Or do you think when he started to follow Jesus was a very lovely, very peaceful path? No. And Jesus, when came to talk to him, didn't advise him, right? Oh, you're gonna go through this, you're gonna people are gonna throw rocks on you, you're gonna be shamed. No. Otherwise you're gonna bye, I'm going back to where I was. Jesus don't tell this to us, right? Just go and do your part. So he accept all what he was having after that. He's totally accept. He changed from the inside out. He changed completely. Living with fidelity, passion, and devotion for Jesus. The same passion, the same devotion he had to defend his law, now he turned to defend Jesus. The same strong man. And that's exactly what Jesus wants from him and wants from all of us. All of us, right? We use the same commitments we have for the things of the world and dedicate to practice of the gospel. Right? So that's exactly what Jesus calling us for, this change inside us. Don't worry, okay? Don't go after the door and say, oh, I need to change my name too. No, you don't need to change your name. You don't need to change your status. You don't need to change your culture. No. In that period, he needs to do that, but today we don't need to do that, okay? Don't worry. Don't run and say, no, I'm not going to do that because I love my name and I'm going to need to change my name. No, you don't need to do that, okay? What do we need today? We need discipline, we need action, and we need the most important. I think most of my friends here, you know what is that? The IT commitment. Do you know what is that? Yeah, who think about the computer or something like, no. It's less complicated, I think. No, the computer is more easy than the IT we are talking about here. It's the inner transformation. Transform ourselves inside out, right? This is what's the most important we need to do. And are we listening to Jesus' call? Think inside us. Are we really listening to him? Are we acting? Or are we prefer to just, oh no, I have a library at home, right? Some friends already saw our library at home. It's sometimes I tell my husband, please don't bring me more book at home, please. So it's easy for us have a library at home, read this 1,000 books and say, I'm ready. Okay, I'm ready, but you still sit down on the chair, doing nothing. Is that exactly what Jesus wants? Our intellectual? Just our intellectual? No. He wants action, right, from us. Just not our intellectual knowledges, right? We are capable for this change. Look at example of Paul. He left all his old values, accept the change, use the same knowledges he had before. His speech, he was a very strong man, very, like Erika told us, he went to his talk, his speeches. Thank you. He was amazing. He used that now. The same way, but with love, with compassion for others. And went to help people as well. We can see in sorry, I just forgot to show that, okay, when he's finally found Jesus, okay. Here when he couldn't see through his physical eyes, right? And on this passage of one of these letters he wrote to Corinthians, we can he say like that, we clearly see his change here. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I become a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. What he wants to bring for us this message. When he was that old man, the past, cruel, right? Strong in terms of defend his law, right? He acted what he was a child. He didn't know what he was doing inside him. And when he find Jesus, he just changed. The clothes he say there, it's the outs, not the material clothes, right? Was his feelings, was his belief. So he changed and he become a new man. He born again. You can say that. He reborn again. Right? And he put all this past behind and try and help to spread the Jesus teaching, and that's why he turned in one of the most important disciples, and his letters really touch us deep, really touch us. So we need to start. We can't be like a Paul. Yes, we can. Nothing special on him. Nothing. We cannot able to do as well. But we need to accept and listen from inside out. Thinking about what I'm doing today to help myself to be a good man. To help to grow in terms of spiritual talk, right? Way. Like I said, doesn't matter you have thousands of books to teach you that, but you don't put in act. You need to act. Put in practice everything we are learning today. It's easy? No. Jesus never told us what's easy to follow him. Never. But we need to be strong. We need to, if you want to change the person beside me, I need to change myself first. Right? So that's our message. And really recommend you read the book. You go see all this change with emotion. Like, it's indescribable emotion. And my friend Rafael is going to talk now about his path after this beautiful, it don't have magic transformation. It's not a magic. We can do that too. Rafael, please.
Hi, everybody. So I was so concentrated listening to Michelle and Erika that I forgot I had to talk. So there's really a lot to talk about Paul's life and his history. It's a very intense book, and we can use for so many lessons. There's so much that we can learn from from his life. In my opinion, this is the most important example of Jesus' plan for us. There was a lot of firsts. He was the first persecutor, the first person that died under his orders, which was Stephen, was the first Christian that died for Jesus. And when he converted, he was the first apostle to spread the word of Jesus outside of the Jewish culture. So it is something it's like a chain reaction that happens, and it closes at the end when he is inspired, when he became, after everything that happened that Erika told us, and after the conversion that Michelle told us, when he really became the apostle, when he changed his name, since I'm completely different now, I assume a completely different mission. So then Lucas, actually his friend, advised him, now you are completely different, you are following a completely different path, so why don't you change your name? It's spelled the same, in Hebraic is the same, So it's spelled the same. We just call it a different name in the first letter. So we call instead of Saul, we call Paul. But it's when you write, it's the same name. So that was the advice that Lucas gave him, just to mark his new path. So he was the first guy that decided to go to the Greek cities, to go to Rome. Most of his life he spent on the road. He was always walking, and it was always on foot. He didn't have a horse, he didn't have money, he didn't have anything. So he was always on foot. That's why he wrote so many letters. Because after every place that he went, he founded a church. So there was always, well, of course, he was beaten, he was punched, he was kicked, he was stoned. But there was always one person, at least one, that wanted to hear him. And that's all he needed. With that person, he could create a church at that place. And he kept going, moving on and on and on. So he founded several churches. And those churches, they needed it. How can we say it? It's hard for us to grasp the idea of that beginning of Christianism. The persecution that he himself started, it's somewhat like what we see today in Syria. There was a lot of Christians, a lot of followers of Jesus, that they had to flee Jerusalem and other cities because they were being killed. He started that. They were all afraid of him. He started that. And he was victim of that when he converted. So it's a full circle. And in the end, we see what is this plan of Jesus. I'm going to explain more about that. Why I'm saying the plan, Jesus' plan for us. So during this whole persecution, he was actually being inspired by the first victim, which is Stephen. Stephen was always with him, side by side. And Paul had mediumship. He was always a medium. So he could talk, but he could communicate with Stephen. He could feel Stephen close to him. And at the most difficult situations, he could receive inspiration and move on. He was still a man. He was still, at some point, after being beaten so many times and being very, very weak by lack of food and by walking so much, there was nothing else for him to deliver. He was spent. And at those times, he received a new energy. So it's amazing when we read the book and we see that his incarcerators was actually afraid of him. Even the emperor at that time was afraid of him. But he was a frail man. Emmanuel tells us that even his walk was kind of crooked because he was full of scars. He had been lashed so many times that his body was always scarred. And he was very, very thin. But his eyes and his words were so powerful, it reminds me of Socrates. It's kind of we get the idea that he had the same power with words. And of course, it wasn't just him. He was conveying the inspiration that he was receiving from Stephen and for Jesus himself. So we see that people are actually afraid of him because they cannot deny his words. They could not say that what he was saying was not truth. So they could not argue with him because what he was saying you cannot deny. So that's why people thought that he was very dangerous, and that's why he was persecuted himself by those who took upon his role as persecutor. So that's one of the reasons that he was always traveling. And since in those first days, it was so hard for the Christians. There was so much pain among them that they needed his counsel. They were always asking for his advice in this matter or that matter. So he had to write the letters. He couldn't be everywhere at the same time. He was getting weaker and weaker and older. So he couldn't be in all those places, all those churches. So then he decided, okay, so I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write letters to all of them. And those are these famous letters that brings to us, to this day, the true interpretation of Jesus' plan. So that when he was writing, was another type of mediumship. He was highly inspired when he was writing. And the Gospel of Lucas, that's something very interesting that we learned from Emmanuel. He wanted to write that Gospel. He knew Mary, the mother of Jesus, when she was living with John in not Antioch. Well, one of the Greek cities, since John was Greek. After Jesus went back to the spiritual plane, John moved to this city, and Mary was there with him. We learn this story in the book Boa Nova, the Good News. There's a chapter that talks about Mary. So Paul wanted to write a gospel based on the teachings of Mary. Mary was the mother of Jesus, so she knew a lot about Jesus, and he wanted to write a gospel. But he went to Rome first, and he knew that he wouldn't come out of Rome. He knew that that was his last trip, and he would discarnate there. He had been informed about that, so that he could take the proper measures, so that the Christianism would continue. So he asked Luke to go to Mary and write the Gospel of Lucas. So this is a very interesting point in the story. So anyway, the message that I wanted to bring, as I said, there's so many things that we can talk about this story, but I focus on something that in my point of view is very important, and I always question that when we read the story of Paul and Stephen, and when we read 2,000 years ago and 50 years later, all from Emmanuel, that talks about the beginning of Christianism. There was so much suffering, and I always ask, why would those people suffer so much? They were spreading the word of Jesus. Shouldn't they be protected by Jesus himself? Why is that they had to be eaten alive by lions and wolves and bears in the circle of Rome, circus, or burn alive? Or the only limit was the Roman imagination to how they could kill the Christians. So why was it that Jesus allowed all those sufferings? Then it dawned on me. So, in order for me to interpret that and to explain, I divided, let's say, if I can say that, Jesus' plan in 3 principles. To make it easy, or easier to understand. First principle. Jesus' plan for the spiritual development of humankind, it's a long-term plan. How long? Decades? Maybe 30 years, 20 years? No, centuries. So we are here 20 centuries after the first deliverance of his teachings. So it's something that is beyond a human life span. So it's something that it takes several lives, several reincarnations, and Jesus knew that. That's why he wasn't in a rush. Second principle. His plan is based on the seeds of love that we have in us. We were created with that seed in our hearts. We all have that, the seed of love. We just need to make that plant grow, to make that seed develop. We all have that. There are several toxic environments that we create in our heart that prevent that plant, that tree of love to grow. We make that tree weak and we make that seed to not develop. But it is there. It is there. Third principle. The spiritual development is to reach everybody. Everybody. Not just the victim that is there suffering. The persecutor as well. The guy who's torturing, that guy has to be changed too. He's not to be killed, or he's not to be persecuted himself. There's no place for revenge, since that person has to be converted too. Everybody. So those three principles actually, in my opinion, make us understand in a much clearer way why it takes so long for this plan to spread and to produce fruits. That's why I said that the history of Paul is one of the most powerful examples of this plan, because he was the persecutor himself. And in the end, we have the first victim inspiring the first persecutor through the first spread of Jesus' words outside the small Jewish community. And in the end of his life, when Paul was executed by a Roman soldier who didn't want to execute him. He didn't want to execute him. But Paul said, this is your job, this is your duty, so you have to execute me. So and this started by his own movement. So he was persecuted because he started this movement. So anyway, so when he had his throat slit by the Roman soldier, and he finally find himself in the spiritual world, one of the first spirits to receive and embrace him was Stephen. And when Jesus sees that, Jesus was there himself. When Jesus sees that, he says, that is the nature of my plan. The victim and the persecutor embrace each other and love each other. So it closes the book showing what is the objective of all that suffering. But it's still not clear why there's need to be suffering. When Paul was Saul, when he was still defending the law of Moses, what he wanted was to find peace. He thought that by making or enforcing with violence the law of Moses, he would get rid of those rebels that was desecrating the word of Moses, and he thought that he would find peace. That's what he wanted. He wanted peace for everybody. That was the only thing that he knew how to do, to stone people to death. That was the law of Moses. When he was doing that, and he comes across with the Christians, at that time there were people of the way. Luke, again, was the guy who created the term Christians, and after everybody accepted, then we became the Christians, but before that we were people of the way. Those guys had the peace that he was looking for, and he couldn't understand that. Stephen, when he was being stoned to death, stone by stone, breaking his bones, bone by bone, he was still emanating that peace. And he could not understand how come I be looking for this all my life. And those guys, in his view, that don't have any education, they don't have money, they are barely dressed, they live in misery. How can those guys have the peace that I don't have? The suffering of Stephen's martyrdom, is what started the change in Saul. When Jesus appeared to him at the road to Damascus, he was already changing inside. He was at his chariot and he was meditating about all that. So it was like a movie going through his head. This all his life following the law of Moses, and then when Jesus start appearing here and there and here and there, first it was the first time that he went to see Stephen, and then he learned that Stephen was actually his fiancé's brother. So Jesus was there too, and then his fiancée died, and before she died, she had become a Christian herself. So everywhere he looked, there was Jesus. He couldn't get rid of this Jesus. That's why he was persecuted so much, because he wanted peace. And he didn't realize that the peace was not in fighting against Jesus, it was to accept him. To accept the mission that he had already accepted before. He just didn't remember. So he was already in this process of changing, and when Jesus appears to him is when he finally realized everything. That's why he cries so much. Emmanuel tells us that he started crying waterfalls, and he couldn't stop crying. So he took him from the floor and take him to the city, and he was crying all the time. So they thought that he had gone crazy from the heat of the desert. But the thing is, he was crying because he had finally found the peace that he wanted. So all that pressure, it came out. So he let loose, and it was like a huge relief that he found at that time. He finally found what he was supposed to do. So after that, he spent 3 or 4 years in the desert just studying. At that time, the only document we had was the notes of Matthew or Levi. So he had received that from his professor, his first teacher. Again, Jesus was there too, because his teacher, that taught him how to be a doctor of the law, became a Christian. So before his teacher died, Gamaliel was his name, he gave him a set of notes of the teachings of Jesus that had been written down by Levi and Matthew. So he spent a long time studying the teachings of Jesus, and after that he goes back to the Church of Jerusalem. So imagine this, the first time he went there was to kill them. So when he appeared again, they were all very scared. Of course, he was completely changed. His skin was very dark. He had spent a long time in the desert, and he was very thin, and his eyes were different. He was humble now. But it took some time. They let him stay outside for a few hours until they actually, more than that, they told him to sleep in a tavern close by, because they needed to decide if they would let him in or not. He was the first persecutor. So they let him in. And in that moment, there is a very important lesson from Peter. I don't know if we have time. Maybe we have a few minutes. Is it there in the slides?
Yeah.
This is a very important lesson. The thing is, when Paul still had all that energy, the same energy that he used to enforce the law of Moses, he reflects now for the teachings of Jesus. He was still the same guy with the same power for words, and he wanted everybody to know that Jesus was the Messiah. He wanted to convert everybody. So at that time, that he wanted to go to the synagogue and preach to everybody, and he knew that they would kill him, because he had already been there and he was almost killed. He wanted to go back. He said, I don't care if I'm murdered. I don't care. It's, in my view, is what I deserve. Then Peter gave him this very important lesson, which says, no one is forgotten. Remember that God is providence for all of us. In order to judge a situation better, let's say you were more fortunate than Judas. The same anxiety that Paul was showing was shown before by Judas. And we saw what happened with Judas' plan. Judas was never a traitor. He just wanted that the word of Jesus to be spread faster. He wanted to convert more people. He was never a traitor. But he was too anxious to understand the first principle, that is a long-term plan. And then he said, let's say that you don't fail like Judas did. Let's say you were personally victorious in what you have to propose to do. And let's say you were able to attract the entire city to the master. Then what? Should you and could you answer for all who responded positively to your efforts? Should you be the one that rally everyone under Jesus' ban? And could you answer what everybody, so you call everybody and tell them that Jesus can give them the kingdom of heaven? Can you do that? If everybody's there around you asking for the kingdom of heaven, what would you do? You can't do anything. You cannot convert them. We cannot convert people. That's what Michelle was saying. It's inner transformation is inside. It has to come from inside. So this is very important, and it tells him to be patient and to understand Jesus' plan. That's what is. We have this seed of love, and the suffering that they went through, it awakes this seed of love, as it happened with Saul. His seed awoke when he saw Stephen, the martyrdom of Stephen. That's why there was so much suffering. That's why those Christians, they had to undergo so much suffering. Because even those who were torturing them were converted from inside out. Something in their hearts awoke. It doesn't mean that we need everyone who wants to spread the word of Jesus will have to go through all those sufferings. We need to remember that at that time we were barely changing from a primitive world to a proofs and atonements world. So it was a world that was still very primitive. So all we knew how to do was to destroy. That was our first instinct, to destroy the unknown, the threats. So what does this tells us today? First, we need to be patient. Sometimes we want to spread Spiritism in the same way. Those lessons are still very true and very alive today. Sometimes we want to do the same thing with Spiritism, since it brings us so much happiness, and tells us what peace is. But we need to understand that this plan is a long-term plan. Today we live in a world where very few people do not know who Jesus was. So it is working. It is working. It takes time. So we do our part. We have a small house. We have the internet today. But there are different pockets popping up every year, everywhere around the world. We just need to be patient. Second thing, our example. As the apostles, they taught and they allowed people to be converted through their example. We have to show our example as Christians. As Joana de Angelis tells us in this book, Happy Life, we never know who is watching. We have our family members. Some of us have kids. We have parents. We have friends. We have people in our office, people who work with us. So let's try to change ourselves in our normal daily life routine. Try to see what is the best way to behave like a Christian. Sometimes just being silent to an offense or someone that is mean to us. That person has to be changed too. That person that today is mean to us, if we respond in a way that is not as mean, that person is going to remember us. Maybe it's going to take a long time, but that's going to be marked on that person. As some of us remember when we are mean and we are responded with love, we do remember. We have that in our mind, and that changes us. So we are already past 5 minutes, and I'll finish here. Thank you guys very much.
Come back. We still have, I guess we have some minutes to ask some questions. If one, they're not showing up. Okay, any questions here in the crowd? Anybody want to ask a few questions? Because I have a lot of questions. Oh yeah, we have Joe.
This book is in the top 10 of any Spiritist mandatory reading, but it does not talk about Spiritism. Why is that possible? Why is this book so important to Spiritists? And why would anyone choose to tell the story? Repeat the question, please.
So this book is not a Spiritist book, but it's one of the main books that all Spiritists normally read. Why? How can this even be possible? Right? That's the question.
Well, I would dare to say that because the label of being a Spiritist or not is not what exactly matters. I'll just show the book again. What really matters is love, and Spiritism is just another label, another way of us to understand love and to be able to put love into action. And so technically this is not a Spiritist book, but whatever talks about love is Christian, is a Spiritist. So that's how I understand. I don't know about you guys.
And actually, we see a lot of what we learned from Spiritism in the book. For example, before Saul became Paul, he saw Abigail, his fiancée, who had already discarned, and Stephen. They both came to him in a vision. So he saw them. And several times later, he communicated with Stephen. So he received inspiration. And when he discarned, he is received in the spiritual world by Stephen, Abigail, and Jesus. So he is received. After all the suffering that he went through, he actually saw his churches as beacons of light. And he is received by his family. So then he received everything that he planted, he received on the other side. He was not injured anymore. He was not a frail old man anymore. He was strong and happy. So that's the message that Spiritism passes to us. So understand your pain here and embrace it. Embrace it. Live through it. Because our life, it's there.
And just to close here, teach us the real meaning of love, forgiveness, and move on. Right? We need to learn to forgive, to love, and the action and reaction, right, from our acts. So that's why we can connect with the Spiritism, because teach us, right? And that's why we need. It is some inner transformation, not somebody else can do for us. We need to do for ourselves, right? Learn how to really love, to forgive, and to accept. Right? So in this book show us very clear all those messages we've been learning and we're not put in practice yet.
Do we have any questions? No questions. So we are past the time now, so we are going to prepare for the passes. Thank you all for watching us over the internet. We expect you guys again next Sunday, and have a blessed weekend.